morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. We will begin with 5 minutes of opening remarks by myself and my distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley of Iowa. We'll proceed to the testimony of our witnesses, and after that, we will have time for conversation with the senators who are here in 5-minute increments, and then we will conclude the hearing. I am very happy to be able to host as chair this 8th Budget Committee hearing examining the economic risks and budgetary costs associated with climate change. Today, we are very fortunate to hear from prominent political leaders who will discuss the costs associated with climate change. Prime Minister Turnbull led Australia from 2015 to 2018 as the head of a centre-right government. The United States and Australia share many similarities. Both are continent-sized democracies. Both are vulnerable to climate change, with long coastlines, large cities, and productive agricultural regions, vulnerable to worsening sea level rise, wildfires, floods, heat waves, and droughts. Australia is also, of course, home to one of the wonders of the natural world, the Great Barrier Reef. My wife, the marine scientist, would insist that I mention that, whose very existence is threatened by a warming and acidifying ocean. Senator Bill Frist served the state of Tennessee in the United States Senate from 1995 to 2007 and served as our Senate Majority Leader from 2003 to 2007. He is now the Global Board Chair of the Nature Conservancy. Senator Frist is also a doctor who, since leaving the Senate, has traveled widely, engaged in medical charity work. During his travels, Leader Frist has had a front row seat to the public health costs climate change is imposing on countries around the world, whether from increased heat waves, more frequent droughts leading to food and water insecurity, or degraded air quality. Last week, we held a hearing on the costs associated with fossil fuel subsidies, including public health costs, and I would like to add to the record of this hearing a new environmental research paper that supports the message of that hearing. It's titled Air Pollution and Health Impacts of Oil and Gas Production in the United States, without objection. And we also held a hearing on the dangers of nearing a debt limit default. At the default hearing, several members expressed a desire to come together and work to strengthen America's long-term fiscal position. I share that desire. A serious conversation about the nation's long-term fiscal health requires that we reform our budget process, but also that we address potential future shocks to the economy that would upend the most carefully laid fiscal plans. We could raise revenues and reduce spending and balance the budget, but if the economy goes haywire into a climate-driven crash, and we have heard very knowledgeable testimony that multiple separate climate-driven crashes are possible, then massive budget deficits will loom. That is the entire reason why this committee, the Budget Committee, is holding hearings on climate change. We've heard that more than $10 trillion of our national debt stems from the 2008 financial crisis, a warned of economic shock, and the COVID pandemic, another warned of shock. Now, central bankers, economists, financial experts, real estate professionals, insurance CEOs, and academics are all warning of systemic risks to the economy from climate change. There are many: coastal and wildfire area property value crashes, carbon bubble collapse, dislocation in insurance markets, and they are of the sort that could cost the economy trillions. We cannot separate our nation's fiscal health from these looming and potentially catastrophic risks. Our witnesses today, political conservatives, are well placed to remind us that there is nothing inherently conservative about ignoring climate change. There are market-based solutions available that align exactly with conservative economic principles. Since climate change is at heart a matter of physics, chemistry, and economics, and not ideology or belief, there is a common platform of fact upon which to rely. Bipartisan achievements like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Montreal Protocol, eliminating ozone-destroying fluorocarbons, and the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act prove that tackling climate change could be a bipartisan priority. Little achievements, like the growing climate solutions law, the 45Q carbon capture credit, and nuclear reforms, are current bipartisan building blocks. The ranking member has long championed wind energy and ethanol fuel. There is bipartisan work on an international pollution fee to pair up with the EU's CBAM. Bipartisan progress is possible. Indeed, this past weekend, Senator Cassidy and I spoke at the McCain Institute's annual Sedona Forum in Arizona about pollution tariffs. I was, of course, reminded of John and how different things were when I arrived in the Senate in 2007. Back then, there was significant bipartisan work on climate legislation in the Senate. We must find a path back to bipartisan work on climate. At a time when our nation faces many looming challenges abroad, if we are unable to come together at home to address a fundamentally non-ideological issue, the warming of our planet due to carbon dioxide pollution from fossil fuel combustion, then our democracy is not functioning as it should. We owe it to our children and the world to get this right, and I now turn to my ranking member to join in the introductions with the former governor of Ohio, Terry Branstad, who I join in welcoming.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to our panel. Today marks the 8th hearing on climate change. Today's hearing is in a much bigger room than the normal budget committee hearing room. We have a very large audience, which we don't always have in that room, and we have an impressive panel of government leaders to educate us. If only we were using this platform to shine light on the need for Congress to address an unsustainable debt. Just this week, the Government Accountability Office issued a report calling on us to do just that. Yet, the other side continues to ignore their core budget responsibilities of the committee and as the Congress of a whole. But I can't say I'm surprised anymore. Senator Marshall hit the nail on the head last week when he asked this, quote, "Why do we have this religious experience with climate rather than using common sense?" End of quote. I've been asking myself similar questions since our first hearing. How do we get Democrats interested long enough to fulfill budget responsibilities for the American people? Now, only in D.C. could we have 8 climate change hearings while spending our country out of house and home. Only in D.C. could we show up to work on Tuesday afternoon and leave town on Thursday while we're approaching default in our national debt. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats haven't even attempted to write a budget resolution. But as we continue to focus on climate change for the 8th time, I'm glad to welcome my friend, longtime friend as well, Ambassador Branstad, but in Iowa we refer to him as Governor Branstad. As the longest serving governor in American history, Ambassador Branstad understands that we can reduce emissions and grow our economy at the same time. I might add that he broke Governor Clinton's record of New York early 1800s, or late 1700s, early 1800s, to hold the record that he now holds for 22 some years, I believe, being governor of Iowa. Now, alarm won't impede the impact of climate change. A combination of adaptation, mitigation, and sound fiscal policies will. Former Governor Branstad and I worked together during his time as Iowa governor to advocate renewable and alternative energy solutions. And now Iowa gets 60% of its energy from wind and leads the nation in ethanol production. We also opposed destructive federal policies, which would have driven up cost and meddled in the lives of hardworking farmers and businessmen. We don't need aggressive taxes to drive down emissions, and we certainly shouldn't cripple our economy with more federal regulations. Iowa has a $90 million deficit. When former Governor Branstad took office in 1983, when he left office in 1999, Iowa had a $900 million surplus, and he'll see his successor, Governor Reynolds, and the Republican legislature building up on that surplus. But we reduced emissions while erasing the deficit. But these impressive reductions only go so far. Even if the entire United States stopped emitting greenhouse gas tomorrow, projected temperatures would only be 0.3 degrees lower come 2100. Under this unrealistic scenario, the United States will still need major polluters like China and India to pull their weight. During his 3 years as U.S. Ambassador to China, Ambassador Branstad experienced the impact of China's pollution firsthand. He saw how China mistreats its own citizens, violating UN human rights standards, and American companies were mistreated as well. I look forward to hearing the ambassador's firsthand account of his leadership in China and whether he believes President Biden's policies are on the right track. I also welcome Prime Minister Turnbull and former friend and colleague, Majority Leader Friss as well. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I'm pleased to have three such distinguished witnesses here to testify before us today. First, we have the Honorable Malcolm Turnbull, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. In addition to having served as Prime Minister from 2015 to 2018, he served as Minister for Communications and Minister for the Environment and Water. Prior to his political career, he worked as a lawyer, banker, and businessman. He currently serves as a director of the International Hydropower Association. We're delighted to have the Prime Minister join us here today. We will then hear from the Honorable Dr. Bill Frist, who represented Tennessee in the United States Senate from 1995 to 2000 Senate, serving as the Senate Majority Leader from 2003 to 2007, and indeed serving as a member of this very committee. Welcome back. Dr. Frist is also a renowned surgeon, having pioneered heart-lung transplants. Since leaving the Senate, he has continued to work in the medical field and currently serves as the Global Board Chair of the Nature Conservancy. Senator Frist, thank you so much for joining us. Last, we will hear from the Honorable Terry Branstad, the 39th and 42nd Governor of Iowa and the 12th United States Ambassador to China, where he served from 2017 to 2020. With a total of more than 22 years as governor, he's the longest-serving governor in U.S. history. In addition to his political and diplomatic career, he served as the president of Des Moines University and is the current president of the World Food Prize Foundation. We welcome Ambassador and Governor Branstad. Prime Minister Turnbull, please proceed for your 5 minutes opening statement. Your full statement will be made a part of the committee record.
Australia, as you said, is around the same size as the lower 48, the United States, but it is flatter and much drier, very vulnerable to the impacts of global warming. Climate and water availability in particular has always been variable, and global warming is making it much more so. The terrible black summer fires of 2019-20 were unprecedented in their extent, over 24 million hectares, and their damage, in addition to 33 people killed, over 3,000 homes destroyed, $10 billion in property losses, and nearly 3 billion animals either killed or displaced. Many environments and ecosystems, such as rainforests, may never recover. 1 in 100-year floods seem to be coming around every few years. Only last year, I saw the Premier of New South Wales stand on a street corner in Lismore, surrounded by flood debris, to tell the media the flood was a 1 in 100-year event. I'd stood on exactly the same spot as Prime Minister only 5 years before and said the same thing. So it's pretty clear that the consequences of global warming are increasing, are real, and we're living with them. You can put dollars on these problems if you like, but I think it's very hard to estimate it. Deloitte has estimated the cost of natural disasters alone in Australia are running now at $38 billion a year and going up every year. Our Bureau of Agricultural Research and Economics has estimated that global warming is reducing average farm income by 23% over the next 20 years. Now, we are at the same time also a very large exporter and producer and exporter of coal and gas. Coal is in fact our second largest export, LNG our third largest export. But the good news is that we have very good renewable resources, both wind and solar, and they are growing apace. To give you an idea of the pace, in 2009, solar and wind were about 1% of our generation. They're now about 31%. The critical thing is going to be developing the firming ability, the balancing ability through long-duration storage, pumped hydro in particular, to make sure that we can make renewables reliable. Now, turning to the politics of all of this, which has been a tortuous and complex story in Australia, frankly, the problem has been that we lost bipartisanship about 15 years ago. I think a similar thing happened in the United States, frankly. On what you might call the right of politics, the populist right, I would say, not the part I occupy, not the true conservatives, because frankly, conservatives believe in conserving things, and one of the things to conserve is the planet we live on and the ecosystems that we rely on. But we got to this point where instead of global warming being a matter of physics, it became a matter of ideology and belief. Now, saying you believe or disbelieve in global warming is about as smart as saying you believe or disbelieve in gravity. You know, you can step out of the second floor window and test your belief on gravity pretty easily, but there has been a lot of denial about the reality of global warming, and this politicisation, that's not quite the right word, they're turning it into a matter of what I used to call, when I was in politics, ideology and idiocy, rather than engineering and economics, has been at the core of the problem. So when I was PM, seeking to make reforms to support the transition to clean energy, my biggest opponents were not in industry, were not actually even in the fossil fuel sector. They were actually on the populist right of my own party, and in particular in the right-wing media, dominated by Rupert Murdoch, who I understand is well known in this country. It was you got a similar story where, we had these terrible wildfires and the Murdoch media were pumping out the message that it had nothing to do with global warming. It was all a matter of arsonists, and poor forest management. It's ludicrous. Obviously, if you have a hotter and drier climate, you're going to get more fires. That is fundamental. So I think the most important thing is, I would say, is for conservatives to get back to the science and the facts. And again, the answer is engineering and economics, not ideology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Leader Frist.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm appearing today before you drawing on three very distinct life experiences. First is a heart and lung transplant surgeon who has taken care of thousands of patients with heart disease and lung disease, both of which are aggravated by climate change. The second, as mentioned, a United States senator on this committee from, I think it was 1995 to 2002. I'm intimately aware of the critical importance of a stable federal budget, both for the physical health of our economy, but also our economic security and our national security. And third, as mentioned, is chair of the Global Board of Directors for the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is one of the most far-reaching conservation organizations in the world, and I say that because we have 900 scientists and science staff across all 50 states and D.C., but also 78 other countries and territories. I understand that the long-term physical and the mental health and well-being of people absolutely require a sustainably healthy planet and climate. A healthy planet and a healthy people, they're inextricably connected. The dedicated people at TNC are working hard to build a future in which nature flourishes and people from all walks of life, and that's important from the equity lens, vulnerable populations, people who are disadvantaged in some way or another, but from all walks of life can enjoy happier lives and healthier lives and more fulfilling lives. Our ambitious goal at TNC is grounded in scale and going to scale based on science to match the severity of these interconnections of biodiversity and climate crisis. And most by definition, these require responsible policy solutions. Recent data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and NASA show that 2022 tied as the 5th warmest year on record. So why does it matter? Well, a warming climate directly impacts the health of each of us and our families and our communities and business and economies. And we're seeing these effects right now, and scientists anticipate that they're expected to grow. The Congressional Budget Office states it quite plainly, and I quote, "Climate change increases federal budget deficits on net," close quote. And they go on to explain why. A reduction of economic output related to lower worker productivity and damage to physical capital, and the corresponding drop in income and payroll taxes will create a drag on federal revenues, while mandatory and discretionary spending demands will increase. In my submitted testimony, I outlined 6 areas, 6 facts. I'll list them now. The most extreme and more dangerous heat waves, these rising greenhouse gases concentrations, increase the average temperatures and make these extreme heat waves more frequent and more intense. In my own field of medicine, cases of heat stroke, cases of hypothermia and related conditions brought on by these extreme temperatures are climbing and in turn exacerbating existing cases of the heart disease that I treated every day, of the lung disease that I treated every day, and renal disease. Second, reduced and contaminated water supplies of more frequent and intense precipitation runoff into our water systems increases the risk of water and food-related illnesses. And then at the other extreme, we have the droughts, which can limit access to water for agriculture, transportation. 3, threatens our food supply. 4, certain deadly diseases are becoming more common. The warmer temperatures lead to some vector-borne diseases, things like the deadly West Nile virus and the chikungunya virus that have appeared really for the first times ever in the last decade in the United States. The poor air quality, the increasing wildlife risk, the federal budget implications, I have outlined. All of these impact human health. All of them impact the financial cost. In 2022, NOAA calculated 18 separate weather and climate disasters that cost the United States at least $1 billion. Already, the federal government covers 1/3 of our health care costs. These health care costs will definitely escalate with this impact of climate change. Again, it's a call for leadership. It's a call for bipartisanship. I believe fundamentally that with time, with the progression of science, with working together in a collaborative way, with recognition of the impact on each of us as individuals today and in the future, that arguing for nature-based solutions will go a long way in bringing us together as a people for the benefit of the United States and the global community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Leader Frist. And now we turn to Governor Branstad.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, I'm honored to be invited to testify before you today on the subject of lessons learned, leadership perspective, and experience in the national costs of climate change. I have spent my career in public service in the great state of Iowa and the United States of America. Leadership is a privilege that I do not take for granted. After 3 terms in the Iowa House of Representatives from 73 to 79, I served as lieutenant governor from 79 to 83 and then governor 83 to 99, and again 2011 to 2017. Iowa's unemployment rate went from 8.5% when I took office to a low of 2.5%, and I left office in 1999 with the biggest budget surplus in history, taking a $90 million deficit to a $900 million surplus. When I became governor for the second time in 2011, Iowa had a projected deficit of $700 million. Needless to say, running a deficit was not acceptable on my watch. Once again, we turned projected deficits into surplus, and now Governor Kim Reynolds is doing an outstanding job of keeping us on track. Iowa ended fiscal year 2022 with a surplus of $1.91 billion in the general fund, $830 million in reserve funds, and $1.06 billion in the taxpayer relief fund. Focusing on the budget, cutting taxes, and instituting growth-oriented policies is a proven formula for success, and the Iowa example shows it. As Iowa's former governor, it's clear to me how agriculture can be a significant boon to our economy and have an enormous positive impact on climate change. America's agriculture leadership gives our farmers a competitive advantage in the global marketplace and the opportunity to lead the world in food and energy. The agriculture potential of the world is still virtually untapped. Plants, including corn, wheat, and rice, are just essential to feeding the world's population, but also they are the Earth's best batteries and nature's best solar panels. Researchers at Carnegie Institution in Stanford University estimate that up to 1.8 million square miles of abandoned lands globally, the equivalent of half of the land in the U.S., are available to grow energy crops. The most significant opportunities for agriculture in the U.S. to bring down emissions are continuing to increase yields on existing cropland, utilizing abandoned cropland effectively, and unleashing the power of renewable biofuels. U.S. crop yields have skyrocketed thanks to continuous innovations in precision farming and seed technology, coupled with good old American ingenuity. According to the USDA, even as the amount of land and labor used in farming declined, total farm output nearly tripled between 1948 and 2019. Farming practices such as no-till cover crops are quickly expanding across the Midwest and are becoming more profitable because of reduced fertilizer use, reducing the input cost for farmers. Today, 1 bushel of corn produces 2.9 gallons of ethanol fuel, 15 pounds of agriculture feed, and 16 pounds of captured biogenic carbon dioxide for bottling, dry ice, and wastewater treatment, and others. Thus, ethanol reduces life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by 40%, 46% compared to gasoline. Once again, we can reduce our emissions and improve our economic standing at the same time. Alarm is not the answer. As a country, we should support energy diversity and development of all domestic resources, creating an all-of-the-above energy strategy. Wind energy now provides 60% of Iowa's electricity. I signed Iowa's pioneering RPS back in 1983. This wind energy standard directed Iowa utilities to incorporate renewables into the state's energy mix, and it continues to drive billions of dollars in private investment in Iowa. The use of renewables can help us build our manufacturing base, create jobs, lower energy costs, and strengthen our energy security. In fact, nearly all of the nation's high-tech companies have placed data centers in Iowa because of our action. Iowa's wind energy standard has now been copied by over 20 other states. My experience as ambassador to China put Iowa's economic success into greater perspective. I have visited the Soviet Union as well as China, and I've seen the disastrous effects of socialism. Free enterprise and limited government are absolutely critical for economic vitality. China is the largest greenhouse gas emitter, and its water, soil, and air quality are extremely poor. I witnessed it firsthand. State-owned enterprises that control fuel distribution in China refused to replace MTBE with ethanol. All 50 American states have banned MTBE for more than, which is a carcinogenic, for over 15 years. The actions that the Chinese government has taken demonstrate that they are not serious about water quality or soil quality for the benefit of the health of the Chinese people. It's unconscionable the way the Chinese government has treated the Uyghurs, the followers of Falun Gong, and most recently the residents of Hong Kong is totally unconscionable. Unfortunately, America's good intentions have been taken advantage of by the Chinese Communist Party. We need to be more vigilant in response to the threat to dominate the world economically, politically, and militarily. Just recently, I read this book, Getting China Wrong. It talks about how America has gotten China wrong for a long time, and we need to change our policies in order to preserve America's worldwide leadership. I look forward to questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Governor. Let me begin with Prime Minister Turnbull. You mentioned the terrible Black Summer fires. You mentioned the 100-year floods happening every 5 years. You mentioned the $38 billion a year in harm that Deloitte has projected in Australia. Those are all terrestrial harms. The United States and Australia are also coastal nations with a significant ocean presence. Would you care to comment at all on the ocean harms and costs that are caused by climate pollution?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as your wife, as a distinguished marine biologist, knows better than both of us, I suspect, the impact of global warming on oceans is shocking. You obviously have the reality of sea level rise, which is doing so much damage to coastal communities, threatens with essentially destruction low-lying island nations in the Pacific. But it's also done a lot of damage to the Great Barrier Reef, and we've had a series of bleaching events which have been driven by warmer temperatures. I have to say this is an issue that the Australian government, and I mean governments, it's not a partisan thing, my side of politics and the current government are both at one on this, have been putting huge resources into it. Most of the money has been spent on trying to stop runoff into the reef, so particularly agricultural runoff, which has nutrients that have very adverse effects on the reef. But the fundamental challenge is the one of temperature, and that can only be dealt with by reducing the world rapidly reducing the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere so that we can stop this continued growth. But the oceans are definitely under threat. They've done a great job. They've been a temperature sink, but that is coming to an end, and I think there's a reckoning.
Leader Frist, thank you for recognizing the economic issue that climate change presents, and indeed, thank you for thanking the committee for recognizing that and proceeding with this work. You've talked about the $122 billion plus disasters, the 5,000 lives lost, the $1 trillion costs, indeed the $134 billion in cost in just 4 risk areas. In the context of all that expenditure, does it make sense that it should be free to pollute with carbon dioxide and methane emissions?
Appreciate your mentioning in the testimony the budgetary implications, because my experience on this particular committee is really leading me to conclude, and the reason I wanted to testify is the broad impact across every budgetary aspect, everything that we consider. We need to put through this frame, and I think we're doing a better job as we go forward. there are various ways that you can put a monetary value on carbon, and we've debated it, for the last 15 years or 20 years ago when I was in this body, whether it's a carbon tax. And from a Republican standpoint, we don't like taxes for the most part, as you know. But the default position is you say, okay, we're not going to talk about it. I will say from a market-based conservative standpoint, putting a price on carbon emissions makes it understandable from a market sense, but from a flexibility sense, instead of over-regulating. Regulations tend to be stifling. You can't change them. Once they're there, it's just almost impossible to get them away. So personally, and the Nature Conservancy would say, putting a price on carbon emissions with responsibility. And yes, you have to make border adjustments coming in. So we can't oversimplify, and border adjustments are very important to do, I believe, coming in if you do it. But it captures the market-based flexibility, the dynamism of the private sector, the coming up with solutions in real time, because nobody has all the answers now. There's not a single bullet here. So I do believe putting a price on carbon emissions with responsibility for that. And then it also allows you, and I'm not here to endorse any particular proposal, it does allow you to use the market to address what we know are now with science are inevitably conditions which are getting worse. And the flip side is it can provide some revenue to give incentives, if properly incented, give some revenues to address these issues or other issues as these revenues come in.
My time has expired. I will turn now to my ranking member, Senator Grassley, and after him, I'll recognize Senator Warner from Virginia.
Governor, the EPA has announced its plan to mandate 2/3 of all new vehicles by electric by 2032. Polls show that most Americans don't want to move in this direction, particularly because of the expense of the electric vehicle. Also, the Chinese Communist Party has a monopoly on critical mineral mining and refining required by most EV batteries, and is forcing the Uyghurs into slavery to bolster their supply chain. What should we be doing as lawmakers to better compete with China and to promote domestic energy security?
The last thing in the world we ought to do is become dependent on China for the rare earth minerals and the batteries. We have renewable energy produced in the heartland of America, and with the sequestration of CO2, it becomes less polluting than electric vehicles. So we ought to be investing in that. That's what we're doing in Iowa. I think in fact, we're partnering with several other states in the Midwest to do that sequestration. We have 3 different projects involved in that. They will be completed by the year 2025, and that will give us an advantage. We don't need to be stupid like California, and they don't even have the ability to generate the electricity if you go to all electric vehicles. And frankly, there's a lot of problems with that, the disposal of the batteries. We could go on, but the biggest problem is being dependent on China, who is our biggest competitor in the world, and they are committed to being the world leader and displacing the United States.
And now a world leader in putting CO into the air. Governor, you served as Iowa's governor for a long, long time. You made sound budgeting and put Iowa's finances into good shape. What fiscal challenges did you face during your time as governor, and what policies did you implement to right Iowa's fiscal ship? How important is it to place honest budgeting practices?
Honest budgeting is critically important. I worked with David Vout, who was our state auditor at the time, to put the state's budget on generally accepted accounting principles and spending less than we took in every year. In fact, I think the spending is down to only 88% of revenue this year, and the result is Iowa, I told you about the big budget surpluses we have, record, and of course, Governor Reynolds, your grandson, the Speaker of the House and Majority Leader in all the members of the legislature deserve a lot of credit. Iowa is becoming a lot more prosperous and a lot more competitive because we've had good, sound budget practices. One of them that we stopped was the legislature purposely underfunding the governor's proposed budget in entitlement programs like Medicaid, and then have to come back and spend hundreds of millions of dollars in the subsequent year because they had purposely underfunded that program. I insisted that that bad practice stop. Governor Reynolds has kept it that way, and Iowa has been on a track of growth and prosperity ever since.
Members of the Congress consistently peddle the alarmist idea that climate change will cause economic shock to the world's market, making arguments that regressive tax hikes and costly federal regulation are the only answer to fight climate change. Is that your experience?
Exactly the opposite. What we have found is investing in renewables and encouraging farmers to have the opportunity to do innovative things such as no-till and cover crops and things like that have made a real difference. And now, of course, we're working on sequestration of carbon so that we'll be more competitive and emitting less than electric vehicles and not have all the problems of being dependent on China for the rare earth minerals and for the batteries and then the disposal of the batteries. They haven't thought this whole thing through. We have a solution, and we're well along in implementing it, and many other states in the Midwest are working with us on it.
Thank you, Governor.
Senator Warner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I want to commend you. This is a very impressive panel. You got a former prime minister, majority leader, governor, and I want to echo one thing I will point out, Governor. I used to be governor of Virginia, and we were very proud of the fact we kept that AAA bond rating. We actually got rated best managed state in the whole country during my tenure, and I think maybe we didn't overlap at that point because I know you've done great jobs in Iowa. We also got named best state for business, something we've had a couple of times. So, but I like that healthy competition. I also want to just point out there was a fascinating article recently in The Economist about Norway, where literally 80% of all the new vehicle purchases are now EVs. It's not seen a dramatic disruption in loss of jobs. The communities accommodated it, and I think there are lessons learned. And I would simply say to the Governor, I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee. There's nobody more focused on China and our competition with China. And I concur that we frankly have turned a blind eye under Democratic and Republican presidents on sourcing those critical minerals. We've been asleep at the switch. Not only did China obtain the sourcing of those critical minerals, but then the processing component. And we're going to have to bring that processing, maybe not necessarily all back here, but with many of our partners around the world. And I think we have to have more of all of the above. One of the things our committee is going to do, Mr. Chairman, shortly is look at the potential in a much broader way on small modular nuclear reactors. I think SMRs for a long time have been overpromised and underdelivered, but I believe we are on the cusp of actual delivery. And China is investing a huge amount. China and Russia are literally getting countries to sign on 50 and 100-year contracts. The kind of nirvana, I worked up on Capitol Hill as a kid in college, the first energy crisis in the 70s, and people started talking about fusion. That could be the ultimate breakthrough. I mean, there are companies now in this country that believe they will at least have commercial demonstration fusion projects in the mid to late 20s. We'll see again whether they can deliver, but a huge, huge breakthrough possibilities. So one of the things I want to start with you, Mr. Prime Minister. We've passed recent legislation here trying to bring back the semiconductor industry to America and with our allies, and I know Australia has done some similar. We've also passed incentives within the Inflation Reduction Act. We have this enormously closer relationship with both the Quad and AUKUS. I was in Australia in October. Can you talk about how on these issues like the governor's mentioned around critical minerals processing, trying to make sure that we are aware of this geopolitical threat around China, how our two countries can collaborate in a closer way.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. Look, Australia and the United States are very, very close allies. Our relationship is intimate and very trusting, and initiatives like AUKUS are making it more so, although it has been very close for a very long time, as you know. You may recall my government was the first Western government to formally ban Huawei and ZTE from 5G. And, you know, I had a lot of conversations with the Trump administration about that in the lead up to that. And frankly, we were ahead of the US in terms of our assessment of the risk. It was a very careful technical analysis, and we concluded that we couldn't mitigate it. So it wasn't a political decision, it was a technological decision. I've written and spoken about that a lot elsewhere. But the fundamental problem was exactly what the ambassador, the former governor, was saying about solar and batteries, was that China was the United States and her friends and allies allowed China to actually take over critical areas of industry, so that you had, in the wireless world of wireless, there was no American equivalent of Huawei or Ericsson for that matter. So you basically had Scandinavians or Chinese companies to deal with. In the renewables area, 85% of solar panels are made in China. Very high percentage of wind turbines, very high percentage of electrolyzers. And so I absolutely welcome the initiatives that are being undertaken by you and others in your government to bring that manufacturing, to actually get manufacturing these critical industries in the United States and with close friends like Australia. You see, I think in the English-speaking democracies, we've always been a bit particularly on my side of politics, you know, on the centre-right, we've always been very sceptical about industry policy. We've said, oh, we don't want to be picking winners, let the market decide. Well, that's fine up to a point. You've got to actually decide what it is you want to do. And China is absolutely focused on that, and that is why they are dominating these areas. So we shouldn't blame China for dominating the solar panel industry worldwide. We should blame, using Australian technology, I might add, but we should be criticising ourselves for not doing more to be competitive. So I totally welcome what you're doing. In terms of rare earths and minerals, we've got a lot of them in Australia. We've got to bring these supply chains back with our friends. That is absolutely critical. Now, even if you take the view that China is not a threat and that they're, they're warm, friendly and cuddly and panda bears, not dragons, all of that, take all of that view, we all understand that a threat is the combination of capability and intent. Capability takes a long time to put in place. Intent can change in a heartbeat. So it just isn't healthy to have so many critical industries completely dominated by one country, particularly one that of whose intent you would have to be very Pollyanna-ish to say is always going to be benign.
Mr. Chairman, I know can I get 30 seconds very briefly? I know
Senator Johnson is next, and he
Yeah,
has
well,
given you
Ron,
an okay.
No, I was just going to say 2 quick points. One, I appreciate what you did with Huawei. Before that, there was Kaspersky. We're now in this country talking about TikTok, which again, Australia has moved on. We do need a rules-based approach that looks at these foreign technologies that pose national security. I've got one approach, maybe others have got others, but I'd hope we get a chance to look at that more broadly. And then, Governor, I just do want to echo one thing as a former governor as well. If you found a way in Iowa to make sure that those gosh darn legislatures don't follow governor's budget recommendations, I'd love to get that solution set.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me start out by stating that I do not deny climate change. I'm just not a climate change alarmist. Climate has always changed, always will. My viewpoint is I don't think there's anything we can really do about it. So rather than spend trillions of dollars trying to hold back the tide, we're far better off using limited resources to alleviate human suffering in a different way. For example, have strong economies so we can afford air conditioning if temperature rises, we have heat waves. Prime Minister, first of all, welcome. You said we should follow the science and the facts. So let's talk science and facts and kind of lay out my case here. Are you familiar with the Vostok ice core sample?
Yes, I am, yeah.
So more than 400,000 years of global temperatures, right? Do you know what the total variation is? We're approaching the top of the 5th cycle. You know what the total variation is?
I'll defer to you, Senator.
22.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Do you know, since the last glaciation period, 10 to 20,000 years, because everybody's concerned about sea level rise. You know how much the sea level has risen in the Bay of San Francisco over the last 20,000 years? Want to take a guess?
Yeah, I'll leave it to you.
390 feet. So my point is, I don't think there's anything man could have done to hold back the tides, to prevent those 22.7 degree variations. Again, that we're in our 5th cycle very consistently. 22.7 degrees. Bjorn Lomborg's done a pretty good job of doing some studies. For example, he did a peer-reviewed paper looking at if every country fulfilled their Paris climate change obligations, that would only reduce global temperatures by the year 2100 by 0.05 degrees centigrade. There's, by the United Nations' own models, if the U.S. were to completely go carbon neutral, that would only impact global temperatures by 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. Do you agree with that science?
Well, look, let me just respond to you, Senator. There is no doubt that global temperatures have fluctuated and sea levels have fluctuated. But there are now, 8 billion people living on the planet, and the impact on humanity of runaway global warming will be devastating. There are whole countries that are going to be, well, look,
it is conjecture. Okay, we don't know exactly.
With great respect, Senator, it isn't conjecture. And honestly, look, I'm in your house, right? So I'll really be deferential to you. But in terms of, you may be right, and just about everyone else may be wrong. But the odds are that the trend, the momentum in the world is to renewable energy. Now, the good news is we can have clean electricity and cheaper electricity and greater national security. So that's the good news. We have the tools on the bench to do the job.
I've got a limited amount of time here. In a previous hearing, we had AEI witness say that we spent about $5 trillion so far combating climate change. In the Inflation Reduction Act, that Orwellian name bill, green energy subsidies, Goldman Sachs said is about $1.2 trillion worth. So, just add those together. $6.2 trillion of money we've spent to try and hold back the tides. Have we made any impact whatsoever on climate? And anybody on the panel think that China and India are going to stop using fossil fuels? The majority witness in our last hearing said, no way. As a matter of fact, we're not going to stop using fossil fuels. Because 80% of our economies have to be powered by it because we're just not there in terms of solar and wind, and they're not reliable enough. So again, I'm talking about reality here. The reality is China and India are not going to stop using fossil fuels. There's nothing we can do to hold back the tides. I mean, it's a fantasy to think we can do these things. So rather than spend $6.2 trillion, we would have been far better off spending that in other ways to alleviate human misery and suffering. We'll adapt. We'll adapt to this stuff. Stop building $1 million properties on the ocean's edge. That's why the costs are going up. So again, my whole point here is let's recognize reality. The climate's always going to change, so we should spend money wisely, not waste it. And that's what we've done. We've wasted at least $6.2 trillion and had no impact whatsoever. That's money that will not recover and money that we could sorely use to alleviate human suffering. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. We have a very distinguished group, and I appreciate all of your testimony, which was reported to me, and I saw some on TV as I was coming over. And it's good to see you, Majority Leader Frist. So, look, let's talk about reality for a moment, and then I'm going to have some follow-up questions. The reality is, as everybody's acknowledged, is we have global warming. And anybody who looks at a simple chart over time will see that greenhouse gas emissions have grown substantially during the industrial age, and that there's a direct correlation between that and the increases in climate change. In fact, it's hard on the one hand to say those emissions don't matter, and then to say, well, they matter, but China's not going to stop doing them. Those are two different arguments. My view is that we need to work in a coordinated way, both here at home and with partners around the world, and with others around the world, to address these important issues, because as we've seen, the costs of climate change are rising by the day, and because there's a great opportunity to invest in clean energy, as all of you have discussed. China is right now eating our lunch when it comes to the processing of critical minerals that are essential for EV batteries. So it simply makes sense from an economic point of view, as the world moves more and more toward clean energy, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles, that we not get left behind. Mr. Turnbull, when I saw that Australia has the largest clean energy bank in the world, called the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which, as Prime Minister, you used to support renewable energy investments during your tenure. It was initially capitalized at $10 billion in 2012. It's invested over $37 billion for clean energy technologies and continues to leverage and recycle those funds. It's a sustainable fund that has substantially contributed to reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. This is something that I've worked on for a very long time here in the United States, starting during my time in the House. I'm pleased that we included a similar financing authority as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Could you talk a little bit about the benefits Australia has seen and how you used that facility during your time as Prime Minister?
Well, thank you. Well, there were basically two agencies established. It was actually by the Labor government, headed by Mr. Rudd, who's now our ambassador in Washington, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and another agency called ARENA, Australian Renewable Energy Agency. ARENA was about grants. It made grants for cutting-edge, new, innovative projects. So it was absolutely a grant program. CFC deployed much larger sums of money, as you've described, and during our, the Liberal coalition's time, we've added capital to it. It earns a financial return. It's a very good business. People often say governments can't run businesses, but this is actually a very good financial business. They provided funding to wind and solar projects initially when the commercial sector were not comfortable with it, and now they are moving to other projects that are, perhaps less, a bit more risky. That their role is really to be a leader, a path leader in terms of financing clean energy, and I think it's been very successful. Again, it wasn't an invention of our side of politics, but it's one that we adopted and really strongly support.
I appreciate that, and Senator Frist, I understand that you've spoken in support in putting a price on carbon pollution, which I agree would be an important mechanism. As you probably know, we don't have the votes here to do it. I've been attending these hearings. I know Senator Romney had supported that idea, at least in concept, but it seems pretty clear from an economic point of view and a climate point of view that you put a price on pollution, you get less pollution, but I will continue to support it. Glad to hear you're supporting that. And Governor Branstad, as I listened to your testimony, I think you would agree that we should be making the kind of investments in clean energy that you made in Iowa, and that we should be making those at the national level. Am I right about that?
Well, I think the states are the best place to do that because the governors are in the best position to know what makes the most sense in their individual states. The federal government is broke and has a huge deficit, and I think your focus ought to be on addressing that, and we're headed for a default by the end of this month. And it's a disaster that you're talking about spending more money at the federal level. We in Iowa, with a huge budget surplus, are in a position to do something.
Governor, with respect, we all want to avoid a default. That seems to be a no-brainer to me. You don't compete against the power of China just on a state-by-state basis, in my view. And finally, when it comes to the deployment of clean energy, it seems to me taking away tax incentives from American businesses is a tax increase we don't want to support. So that's my view. We do need to avoid a default. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't seem to want to close any tax breaks on very wealthy people in America in order to do that, but we should find a way to achieve a deficit, not just threaten default while we're at it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Marshall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that everyone would agree with me that the greatest predictor of carbon production for the world, the #1 indicator for carbon production for the world is a strong world economy. That when we have a strong world economy, we're able to build the infrastructure, implement all these innovative ideas that we have. And to quote someone from years ago, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. We sat in the budget room here, and we should be talking about the budget and that this president will not negotiate on a balanced budget to go along with raising the federal debt limit, that's one conversation. But because of the White House's inflationary policies, we've destroyed our own American economy, and now the rest of the world is suffering. So, like the governor said, we should be prioritizing a strong economy. I think as we talk about energy policy in particular, we need to remember that not only do we want clean energy, we want it to be affordable and reliable, and that contributes. What would be the carbon impact of eliminating every coal plant in the world and converting them to natural gas? That's something that's achievable, something that's measurable. I'll turn my question, first one, to Senator Dr. Frist, and with your relationship with the Nature Conservancy, an organization I've worked with for decades, not a more respected organization out there, focusing on building habitat. And I think a good example to discuss is wind energy and how the Nature Conservancy uses a common sense approach to wind energy. Iowa, Kansas, leading the world in wind energy. I've embraced it, 50% of Kansas electricity from wind energy. But at the same time, Nature Conservancy has fought to protect my grasslands as well, my tall prairie grasslands. Tell me what the Nature Conservancy's secret sauce is for this common sense approach to, look, we want wind energy, but we also want to preserve the habitat. And by the way, the happiest species out there are coyotes who are just sitting at the bottom of these wind turbines in Kansas.
Yeah, thank you. And in my written testimony, I talk a little bit about it. After 20 years in medicine, as a clinical scientist, doctor, written hundreds of papers, peer-reviewed and the like, and then 20 years sitting, or 12 years sitting where all of you are sitting, I did come to the conclusion that we need a common sense approach that can bring people together, that is science-based. And I know science right now is taking a beating after COVID. But that's why joining an organization like the Nature Conservancy that has 900 scientists from all 50 states and from around the world, because we're in 79 countries, to come together.
But you would agree with me, and I'm sorry to cut you off, as you know it's hard to be on this side.
Yeah.
But you would agree there's a place for wind energy and there's a place not for it.
Yes, and I think there's not any single point solution to any of this, but there is absolutely a place for wind energy that is there. We focus on wind, we focus on nature-based solutions. I want to just very quickly go in, like 1 minute.
No, I don't get a minute. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we're taking 3 minutes.
The answer is yes. There's definitely a place for wind energy.
I take the conversation even further. We're concerned about water conservation. We're concerned about floods. So what are we doing in this country to mitigate those? Why are we not, all we do is build higher dikes around Kansas rather than trying to do something with the floodwaters, like building egresses for wetland habitat.
absolutely.
Why are my friends in California letting all this water melt, snow melt, escape to the ocean when they're overreacting to a species issue rather than just water conservation? It's the balance of it. With my one remaining minute, Governor Branson, I'm going to turn to you. Every day I get people from urban America giving me lectures on what agriculture should be doing for conservation. Your farmers and my farmers are out there doing incredible things. And I turn around and ask them, what is urban America doing for the environment? What are they doing when they produce 20% of the methane? Agriculture only produces 10% of it. So what's urban America doing about their methane production? What are they doing to recycle water? I'm sure the people of Iowa are doing a great job. What are some ideas you would have for urban America to maybe look in the mirror and help themselves?
Well, I think they need to quit criticizing the productive people in agriculture. And, you know, I'm now with the World Food Prize, and we're honoring and recognizing laureates from throughout the world that have done things to help reduce poverty and to have sustainable food supply for people everywhere. And so agriculture is in the
That's right.
the leader in the world in helping reduce starvation and making it possible for people to have a better life and to have the food that sustains them. And we want to be able to continue that. And a lot of people in urban Iowa, urban America, don't even know that the corn we're producing is field corn that's fed to livestock. It's not what feeds humans. That's the lack of knowledge about some of these issues. They don't know where their food comes from is a big problem. We need to get urban America out in the country to see what's going on there and how agriculture has changed so dramatically in my lifetime. We're using fewer people and fewer acres to produce more and more, and we're always looking for better ways to do it.
And we're using less fertilizer, less water. We're doing the right things. But again, I would love to ask some experts to come talk to us about what urban America is doing as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Padilla of California is next, followed by Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I got to say I'm inspired by the interest by colleagues in the committee to engage in the conversation of balancing water use, municipal water use, environmental protection, agriculture, and more. Prime Minister Turnbull, thank you for your participation today. In your written testimony, you caught my eye when I read your mentions of water availability as being particularly variable. California and the Western United States, frankly, recently experienced the worst mega drought in more than 1,200 years. And despite recent winter storms that my colleague referenced, the region will continue to face hard choices in the face of dwindling water supplies and increasing demand. Australia shares many of California's climate challenges, including water availability, wildfires, extreme heat, and population growth. Floods and droughts continue to impose social and economic costs on growing populations across the globe. It's not just California and Australia. At the first high-level panel on water convened by the UN, in which you participated, water scarcity was identified as one of the greatest risks to poverty, eradication, and sustainable development. So with that being said, can you share briefly some of Australia's policies compared to those of the United States when it comes to ensuring water availability?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, most water is used in agriculture, as you know. We have got a very different approach to water than you have in the United States, and water is licensed. It is that was really an initiative that began in the 19th century, actually inspired by an Australian politician called Alfred Deakin, who'd observed what he thought were some of the mistakes that were being made in the United States, frankly. So we manage water very carefully. When John Howard was Prime Minister and I was his water minister, we instituted a new Federal Water Act, so the federal government took a role in all interstate water. And we seek to create a balance between the demands of agriculture, cities, and the environment. But it's very hard, as you know, because, it was, Mark Twain, I think, once said, whiskey is for drinking and water's for fighting over. It is very difficult. And the problem is that if you have diminishing water availability because of global warming and longer droughts, then you've got a smaller pie to share. So it's not easy. I mean, there are no easy solutions, but I think it's you need to have a rigorous approach that ensures that water is not wasted, that agriculture uses water efficiently, and that you make every drop count. It's a very there is nothing tougher nor more fundamental in the history of human government than the management of water. So
couldn't agree more. And again, would welcome my colleague into a conversation and a tour of California's. California's been both innovative and aggressive when it comes to all aspects of water efficiency, conservation, reuse, recycling, and more. But another consequence of climate change, the scarcity of water being part of it, but couple that with extreme heat, and we have experienced record wildfires in California over the last decade. But that's one of the areas where we don't just have some common challenges, but we actually have cooperation.
Totally.
There's the increasingly destructive wildfires has brought our two countries together in the form of mutual, informal, technical, and operational support for about 55 years now.
Yep. Your firefighters help us, and our firefighters help you, and equipment is shared. Yep.
And the agreement has been formalized since 2002. In 2019, it was a remarkable year when the United States sent more than 170 firefighters to Australia.
Yep.
This is 1 year after 2018, when Australia sent 100 firefighters to California. Specifically, can you just explain a little bit about the importance and necessity of this partnership as we see wildfire intensity increase due to the impacts of the climate crisis?
Well, the cooperation is absolutely critical. I mean, our seasons alternate. So, your fire season is the other half of the year to ours. So I think there's a enormous amount to be learnt and gained by cooperation in this area, as in so many others. Our countries are very, very close friends, and I think we're getting closer.
So, well, thank you very much. So I'll just end on this. What used to be a roughly narrow and defined quote-unquote wildfire season no longer applies. We see fires of significant size starting earlier in the calendar year and going into later in the calendar year. So we really need to be aware and on the ready close to year-round nowadays. Not sure if that's the same dynamic happening in Australia.
It is.
That'll impact that mutual cooperation that you referenced.
It absolutely is the same. And, of course, heat impacts on water availability as well, because it's one thing to get a given amount of rainfall, but how much gets into the groundwater system, how much gets into the river, and that is going to be affected very directly by the heat in the environment, which of course will cause it to evaporate before it gets into a stream or into a groundwater system. So runoff is being disproportionately affected by hotter temperatures.
Senator Braun, followed by Senator Lujan, and then Senator Merkley, it looks like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got here a little over 4 years ago, and my question is going to be for Dr. Frist, and if we do another round, if you're going to have additional questions, I'll have a few more. A couple things, we share a lot in common other than being close in age. Did you term limit yourself to this place to do it no more than 2 terms?
I did. I came in saying 12 years was about the right amount of time.
Hallelujah. This place needs that more than ever. I wanted to be what you were out of the gate, a doctor, and I chose to be an entrepreneur. And I think I made the right decision there, by the way. But when I decided to come here, it was out of concern for the broad array of issues. And started the Climate Caucus with Senator Coons after he tried to get every Republican to even think about it. And he told me for 2 years it didn't get anywhere. He almost turned away thinking the perfunctory answer was going to be, no, I'm not interested. I said, sure, I would. So for those out there that wonder about this discussion and where conservatives fit in, I can tell you that young conservatives are very, very interested. Faith-based organizations from evangelicals to Catholics are, and probably the business that's most at the forefront that knows something is afoot would be farmers. And I got involved in farming, both tree and row crop, many, many years ago. So I'm a personal member and a corporate member, my company is, that I used to run, of the Nature Conservancy. I think you probably hit the sweet spot of practicality when it comes to how we need to look at it. You didn't have the inherent budget issues. Back, I think it was 2000 when we started putting everything on the credit card here. You were here for a couple years. I'll cite that we were $5 trillion in debt in 2000. After the Bush term, 2 terms, we went up to $10 trillion. I think the other side of the aisle said, if you're going to do that, we're going to double down. Had an issue with the economy. Well, they added another $6 trillion. Structural trillion-dollar deficits. Since then, now they're up to $2 trillion deficits. I love to quote on another issue that I think drives the dysfunction here. Admiral Mike Mullen said, I fear the red ink more than I do the red menace. And the sad interplay to how we've gotten here would be defense hawks in the other side of the aisle that have just put the budget process, everything that works everywhere else, secondary to what they think is most important policy-wise. I see where you think climate is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. I'm going to say that I think climate is something that we need to be engaged in so we don't get walloped with bad policy and that we don't ignore an issue out that is important. How do you kind of put the weight between both issues when one's a bird in the hand going broke systematically to the tune of $2 trillion a year, and that is not a finance is what I ended up doing as an entrepreneur, terrible business plan for anyone. Where do you think the imminent threat of climate compares when it's modeled in a way that it is hard to see what that might be? I know it's of significance. How does that play against the systematic going broke as a country?
You know, first of all, as you can tell, I'm neither the alarmist or the conservation that says we don't care about people, we're conserving just for conserving's sake. And that's why the Nature Conservancy, as you have said, basically says it's about planetary health and human health. And the human health can't be sustained if we don't get the planetary health right. And these long statistics over 500 years are really interesting, but from a scientist standpoint, we live in a different world now. We're in an industrial world. We know we're putting carbon in the air. We know it's wrapping a blanket around. The interesting thing about this committee, we used to budget before most of your time here in 5 years. And this isn't a 5-year issue, nor was HIV/AIDS, which we're in the 20th year of celebration, really, the success. It's a 30, it's a 40, it's a 50-year history. Then we budget a 10-year period, which is what you're challenged to do now. And it is true, this is going to take longer than 10 years. It took longer than 10 years to get here. It's going to be innovation. It's going to be science. It's going to be something that's in my testimony, but I didn't have time for you to hear, the nature-based solutions, which don't cost a lot of money, that are easy to do, that promote biodiversity, that from the emission standpoint can probably take care of 15% of the emissions by just sustainable foresting. I didn't mean close the forest down, but we need to manage them. I mean, we don't need to cut them all down because that creates disease itself. So this is a long-term problem that's going to require not a point solution, not a carbon tax, and not, a loan, and not all of the wind or the solar.
And I agree with all that. That
it-
question, though, was a relative significance in terms of imminence, the red ink or the climate concerns.
Yeah, I think both are important. And to say it's an either or, it's a little bit about saying you're an alarmist or you're not an alarmist. It is absolutely both. If we don't start investing now, the payout will be beyond our 10-year window in terms of the cost to humanity for the climate.
And
I agree.
We
right now,
we are out of time. I think
Yeah.
we'll have another round. Before I do let you go quickly, do you formally endorse federal term limits?
I would probably not, only because real quickly, even as Majority Leader of the United States Senate coming here, I would occasionally, and probably more than occasionally, rely on somebody a little bit older with a little more experience, and therefore I cannot, in good conscience, in this body, the upper legislative body, basically say that everybody should be term limited. It was the right thing for me. It was the right thing, I think, maybe for most people, because the turnover is good, but I stopped short of endorsing federal limits for everybody, or term limits for every federal official.
Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Frist, your testimony, well, first off, thank you for being here, sir. As well, and Governor and Prime Minister, it's really an honor to have you all here. And Dr. Frist, your testimony concludes with a reference to the Nature Conservancy's findings that our nation's recent investments in clean energy and climate initiatives will yield concrete economic returns. Over 500,000 jobs and $50 billion every year for 10 years.
And that's a return of $1.42 on every dollar invested. And that's independent research from the Nature Conservancy. Thank you.
I appreciate that, sir. Now, this is many times the value of the investment that was committed last year. And so I appreciate the explanation supporting that as well. Dr. Frist, is the transition to clean energy not only feasible, but necessary to ensure the long-term well-being of vulnerable communities?
It's absolutely necessary, and it's going to take the innovation and technology, and in the meantime, the mitigation through nature-based solutions and other solutions, including wind, solar, and others.
Dr. Frist, do federal climate investments create the highly skilled jobs that communities need to prosper and that the United States needs to stay competitive in the global energy transition?
Independent research by the Nature Conservancy and our colleagues showed, as you said, this full suite of recent climate and clean energy investments. If we stay on that path, will support over 500,000. We came up with 537,000 jobs, not over 10 years, annually for 10 years. So yes.
I think you answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, Dr. Frist.
Yes, sir.
Do federal climate investments benefit our economy?
Yes, there's no question about it, but it doesn't mean necessarily spend more money just to benefit the economy itself. And that's why the balance of nature, I'm going to keep saying it, the nature-based solutions with the investment in innovation and technology and tax incentives to stimulate the private sector to become intimately involved, I think is absolutely critical. So yes, federal investment is absolutely critical, but it's through what the Nature Conservancy in particular is all about, and it's collaboration, bringing everybody to the table, trying to exclude the things that are not science-based, going with the science-based and putting them on the table. And that'll promote the economy. And it's going to take a while to fix this coming on, and the fix means we have to start now.
I appreciate that, sir. Mr. Turnbull, I particularly appreciated your observation that China is both the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the largest producer of renewable energy technologies. China appears to recognize that the energy transitioning is happening, and with it comes an opportunity for international leadership and economic security. I'm concerned that if the United States does not invest in the research and support the innovation needed to make the clean energy transition, our nation will lose the international leadership. One of the assets we have in the United States is our Department of Energy National Labs, a scientific research network that is unmatched anywhere else in the world. These labs are global leaders in the development of cutting-edge technologies to reduce the climate impacts of energy generation, manufacturing, and other essential parts of our economy. My question, Mr. Turnbull, is the United States and China, are they both competing for international leadership in the development of clean energy technologies?
Well, they are competing, but you'd have to say that China is way in the lead. China is producing, as I said earlier, about 85% of the solar panels, about 75% of wind turbines and, in inverters and so forth. So they're dominating that sector. Now, the technology is not all developed in China. I mean, the core technology in the photovoltaic cell, the so-called PERC cell, was developed at the University of New South Wales in Sydney by a team led by Professor Martin Green. What has happened, and is in so many other sectors, is that America, and I'm not, we're we're all in the same boat, right? America and her friends and allies have just through an absence of mind, I think, an insouciance, allowed China to take the lead in these areas, and then you wake up one day and you say, gosh, there isn't much of an American industry in this particular area, or indeed a Japanese one, or a German one, or a French one, or an Australian one, and that's wrong. So the answer is for all of us to get moving. We can do it. Now, if I could just make one final point, and it's relative to what the Governor said earlier. One of the advantages of some old-fashioned forms of renewable energy, like hydro, and in particular pumped hydro, of which there's a great example in Virginia, and the Bath County pumped hydro system, is that most of its components are concrete and steel, which you source locally. So, we can achieve large levels, we already do achieve large levels of energy storage without using critical minerals or batteries or anything like that. So, as I said, we do have the tools to catch up and become competitive with China in the clean energy technology space, but we need to do it. So that's why, even though it has some competitive issues for us in Australia, we do welcome the vision and the commitment of the Inflation Reduction Act, despite its rather unusual title.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, thank you. I have other questions, but I'll submit them to the record.
Perfect.
Be mindful of time. Thank you.
So here's what's going to happen going forward. I'm going to recognize Senator Merkley for his questions. If another senator comes who has not yet had a chance to ask questions in the first round attends, they will be recognized. In deference to the schedules of this distinguished panel, there will not be a second round. However, as a courtesy to Senator Braun, he will be able to ask one question. Then I will make a closing statement, and we will adjourn. Anybody with a question for the record has about 24 hours till noon tomorrow to get it in, and we'd request all the witnesses to respond within a week if you do get questions for the record. So with that, let me turn to Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you bringing your very diverse political experiences and policy knowledge to bear on this challenge. Mr. Turnbull, I saw in your testimony that you are chair of the Green Hydrogen Association, and we have a lot of different colors for different types of hydrogen, but could you just in a sentence or two explain what green hydrogen is?
Green hydrogen is hydrogen made by electrolyzing water with renewable electricity from renewable sources.
So some have suggested many different uses for such hydrogen. However, it's also been pointed out that it makes more sense to use electricity directly than use electricity to make green hydrogen to make electricity. But some of the uses that have been pointed out have been the role of making fertilizer.
Yep.
And high temperature manufacturing. And are there other, is that a fair summary of the purposes of green hydrogen?
Well, there's a very wide range, but you're absolutely right. The energy loss in the round trip of going renewable electricity, green hydrogen, and then using that in a hydrogen fuel cell or a gas turbine to make electricity again is enormous. So that's not ideal, but anywhere where you need a molecule. So to make ammonia, which is NH3, you need hydrogen for that, green hydrogen for that. You can make green methanol. You can even make green methane if you want, although you've then got the problem of what you do with the carbon dioxide. But, you know, for heavy transport, hydrogen is going to be critical. Steel making, you can use, and green steel is where you use hydrogen to deoxidize the iron ore. You know, at the moment, ferrous oxide is burnt with coal, you know, blast furnace. The carbon attaches to the oxygen, goes up the chimney stack as CO2. If you use hydrogen as that flux, then your emission is steam, H2O. So yes, I think the uses for green hydrogen are enormous. There are debates about how enormous they are. There are. But my own view as chair of the Green Hydrogen Organisation is to simply say this, whether you have the demand frame at the high end or the low end, it is so far in excess of what we're currently producing. I think it's a problem question we don't really have to worry about for a while. We've really got to get cracking on the green hydrogen.
Well, I really support the green hydrogen effort and applications where it's cost effective. I'm very concerned about some of the other forms of hydrogen that derive from methane gas and the life cycle impact in which they can be more damaging to the climate than not. There's a big success in Australia of rooftop solar.
Yep.
Congratulations. 1 out of 3 households. That's remarkable. We have a lot of resistance from our local utilities for distributed solar because they're not making that energy, and it reduces the demand. Did you have policies that kind of essentially helped families overcome the resistance of local utilities to do a lot more rooftop solar?
Well, the answer is yes. There is as part of the renewable energy target, there is a small-scale renewable energy target which essentially subsidises, it's not a huge subsidy, by the way, Senator, but it does subsidise, incentivise rooftop solar. It's become enormously popular, and of course people do it because the solar panels have got cheaper, and you know, generating electricity behind the meter, particularly if allied with a battery, makes for very big savings for householders. So yeah, I mean, solar works. I mean, the reality is solar and wind are the cheapest forms of new generation in Australia and have been for quite a long time now. And particularly the economics are very compelling if it's behind the meter, as it is on a home.
I can tell you that I love looking at my app every day to see what my rooftop solar is doing, whether it's sunny or cloudy day. It makes a big difference. But on average, a little 300 square foot array of solar panels is producing the equivalent of about 3 gallons of gas a day through the year. And when I put it in those terms, it's like incredible. One of the challenges we have in the United States is the amount of money that the fossil fuel industry injects into our elections. An industry that makes profits of $200 to $300 billion a year, they put 1% of that into elections, and it has a tremendous outcome on who's elected and therefore on the policies we pursue. Did Australia have some strategy that limited, if you will, campaign donations in a different way from the United States that kind of prevents the domination by a powerful industry of the election system?
Look, we at the federal level, we don't have. We have a disclosure. You have to disclose donations over. It's now about $15,000, so it's quite a high disclosure level by your standards. Foreigners can't make donations. That was a reform I introduced when I was PM. But apart from that, there are no restrictions. So yes, the fossil fuel sector does make contributions. Yes, they have been very, very influential. There's no doubt about that. But I'd have to say that the business sector overall is well in advance of the political right in terms of their approach to climate. The opposition to taking action on climate is now largely it is less influenced by the fossil fuel sector, which is sort of recognises this change is there, and it has become more a sort of a culture war issue, unfortunately, and that's the, that was the massive wrong turning for the conservative or centre-right side of politics, I think.
Yeah. I am over my time, but thank you very much for hosting this hearing. I really appreciate all of you, and I had lots of questions for you, Dr. Frist, in your role, and Governor Branstad, and very few governors have served 16 years, so congratulations on being very successful in that.
22 years and 4 months.
Oh,
But who's
okay,
counting?
Okay, very
Senator
good.
Braun for one question, and then they're getting ready to close the vote. So I want to inform my colleagues that
Thank you,
if they
Mr.
want to
Chairman.
vote, we need to move.
This question is for Governor Branstad. I've chosen to term limit myself after one term, and it's because I'm an entrepreneur. I think most of the solutions that we wrestle with are going to be solved at the state level without borrowing the money from our kids and grandkids to do what we want to do here. Tell me what you think about where climate solutions, the broad array of issues, but especially climate, where do we best affect these, and how do we pay for it in a way that's sustainable?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with you on term limits. I have, obviously.
It's okay.
We can't agree. No two things that people are going to agree 100% of the time.
I'd
But
agree
in
with that
terms
as
of
well.
addressing these issues, as I mentioned in my testimony, I signed this wind energy law my first year as governor, and now we're the leader in the whole country in terms of wind energy. And we have both affordable and reliable wind energy, and it's made a real difference. So all of these major companies have chosen to put their data centers in Iowa. And a lot of manufacturing has come to Iowa because it's both renewable and affordable. So you need to have both. The other thing is we've been a leader, even going back to when I was in the legislature, with ethanol and biodiesel. And I believe that ethanol, higher and higher ethanol blends will make it possible for us to reduce pollution more than electric vehicles, and we don't have the challenge of the rare earth minerals, the batteries from China, and all that stuff that, frankly, we can't compete with China on today. So, but I'm a real believer in, and of course, the changes, the innovations in agriculture, precision agriculture, minimum tillage, cover crops, all those kinds of things. And now, of course, in my new position at the World Food Prize, we're looking worldwide. What could we do to help bring into production some of these areas that have never been touched? They don't, in Africa and many other places, they could increase their yields dramatically. And that's, of course, what Norman Borlaug did with wheat and prevented nearly 1 billion people from starvation. So I am excited about what agriculture can do to make a real difference in both addressing the climate issues as well as making us economically competitive.
Thank you for your comments, and as governor, I think you balanced your budget every year too, didn't you?
We did, and
Hallelujah.
but I faced a projected deficit when I came to office both times, and I did it once, not once, but twice. And the neat thing is, I had a lieutenant governor who was elected with me. She's built on that, and today Iowa is in the best economic position it's ever been in history. We're reducing taxes and attracting more jobs. And
That's a good business plan. Thank
so
you.
Good closing.
Kim Reynolds has improved in everything I taught her.
A good closing pitch for Iowa from the former governor. First, let me just say that I personally regret that Senator Braun has chosen to term limit himself because I really value him as a colleague. Second, let me say that I'm delighted that each one of you was able to come here today. I don't know that the Budget Committee has ever had a more distinguished panel of a former prime minister, a former Senate Majority Leader, and a former governor, in addition to many other accomplishments in your distinguished career. So thank you very, very much for being here. I think this has been very helpful, and I hope sent a message that bipartisanship may actually emerge in this area. I certainly fervently hope it does. The question that I will ask to Leader Frist and to Prime Minister Turnbull comes out of your testimony. I'll make it a question for the record, so you have time to reflect on it and get back to me. Prime Minister Turnbull talked in his testimony about the need for an orderly transition to clean energy. And Leader Frist talked about the multiple predicted costs from climate harm. And there's an additional factor out there, which is the dangers of a disorderly transition and the dangers of unpredicted harms. And to give you a heads up on what we've seen in this committee already, we've had witnesses who've come in and testified that there are multiple what they call systemic risks, economic risks that will cascade out beyond the immediately affected sector of the economy and do damage economy-wide, in some cases global economy-wide. And those have been a coastal property values crash, with testimony from Freddie Mac's chief economist, a wildfire risk collapse as uninsurability leads to unmortgageability leads to values crash, a general threat to the insurance market as risks become unpredictable and therefore uninsurable, and the carbon bubble bursting in a disorderly fossil fuel transition. Each one of those, individually and separately, has been cast as a very significant economic threat, and nothing prevents all of them from coming to pass in a accumulated multiple economic massacre, if you will. And so I would ask each of you to reflect on that and add any thoughts to your testimony you may have about these predicted but unspecifiable, if you will. It's hard to exactly predict what the amount will be, but the systemic risk problem and the problem of unpredictable, predicted crashes, and catastrophes. And with that, I will call the hearing to its conclusion. Again, anybody else on the committee with a question for the record has until noon tomorrow to file it. To the extent that you can respond to those within a week, I would urge you to do so if you can. And again, with great gratitude to each one of you for your testimony, we'll close the hearing. Thank you.